In the dim light of a single kerosene lamp, smoke coiled lazily beneath the low ceiling of the operations room in Rabaul. October 1943. A heavy rain had passed an hour earlier, leaving the wooden shutters damp and the air thick with humidity that clung to uniforms and skin. On the table stretched a map of the Central Pacific, corners pinned with knives. Circles marked with red pencil bled across the atolls of the Gilberts, tiny specks that seemed too insignificant to warrant such feverish debate. And yet, here, in this fortified headquarters of the Japanese 8th Area Army, voices rose and fell in sharp bursts of laughter. The source of their amusement was a short intelligence brief, an intercepted American technical report describing a new armored landing vehicle. The description seemed absurd, a tracked contraption that could leave a transport ship, crawl into the surf, float like a boat, and then grind its way up the beach under fire. One officer, a broad-faced major from Osaka, tossed the flimsy pages onto the table with a smirk. "American toys," he said, tapping the paper with a nicotine-stained finger. "Steel bathtub with treads. They imagine they can storm our islands with this?" Another officer, younger, eager to impress, chimed in. "The sea itself will kill them before we fire a shot. Their machine is heavy. Salt water will flood it. It will sink with its crew like stones." The room erupted again, laughter echoing off the damp wooden beams. Even the senior colonel, usually cautious in tone, allowed himself a grin. He exhaled a ribbon of smoke, leaned over the map, and muttered, "The Americans are clowns. Their war is a circus." Pens scratched, a few notes taken, but the consensus was already written in the air. The Americans were grasping at fantasies. And then silence, brief, unintentional. A clerk shuffled into the room, placing another set of reports on the corner of the table. Rain ticked against the shutters, and in that pause, something unsettling lingered. Beneath the bravado, a faint unease clung to the edges of the discussion. For months, Allied strength had grown across the Pacific, step by step. And these toys, no matter how laughable, represented something more disturbing: adaptation. Thousands of miles away, across the ocean, the picture looked entirely different. On Oahu, the salt wind carried the smell of oil and hot metal across the sprawling workshops where engineers labored day and night. They were not laughing. Their hands were blackened with grease, their faces hollow from long hours. The machine on the platform was no toy. It was the LVT-2, already nicknamed the Water Buffalo. Its steel hull, riveted and welded, had been thickened after earlier failures. Its decks were sealed against flooding. Pumps thudded rhythmically, tested again and again to expel any water that forced its way inside. The Pacific was not a forgiving place. A storm off Kauai had nearly wrecked 3 prototypes earlier that summer. The memory was still raw among the crewmen who had clung to their helmets as waves battered the machines. And yet, the hulls had held. One officer's field report, preserved in the archives at Pearl Harbor, noted in crisp typewritten lines: severe swell, high surf. Vehicles remained buoyant. Forward propulsion maintained. Hull integrity unbroken. Confidence in design, sufficient for operational deployment. It was hardly poetry, but the words carried the weight of conviction. The Japanese officers in Rabaul could not see this. They could not hear the hammering in the Honolulu yards or the curses of mechanics sealing leaks under the glare of lamps at midnight. To them, the Americans were still a distant enemy, unimaginative, overconfident, clumsy in the tropics. They did not imagine that those bathtubs with treads would be tested not in calm harbors, but in violent seas, where any weakness would have meant dozens of drowned Marines. In a diary kept by an American private assigned to the test crews, a line captures the tension of those nights. "Every time the hatches closed, I thought of my lungs. Salt water doesn't care how well you can swim. If this tin can goes under, no one gets out alive." He was 19 years old, from Illinois, a farm boy who had never seen the Pacific before. The machines survived. One after another, they proved their worth. And slowly, word spread among the Marines stationed on Oahu. Skepticism gave way to something harder, sharper: belief. These ungainly shapes of steel might be their only chance to survive the first murderous yards of a Japanese beach. Back in Rabaul, the smoke-thick room filled again with laughter, and yet, in the corner, A lieutenant who had served in Guadalcanal kept his eyes fixed on the map. He had seen how quickly American improvisations turned deadly. He said nothing. The laughter drowned out his silence. Months later, when the tide rolled in red at Tarawa, men would remember that laughter, though the sound had never reached them. In the archives of the 1st Marine Division lies another diary, written in a slanted, hurried hand. A single line stands out, pinned on the eve of departure. We knew they were laughing. But we knew something else too. The laughter would end the moment we came ashore. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. November 1943. The air on Oahu was heavy with salt, a still humidity that stuck to uniforms and machinery alike. At the Marine Corps training grounds east of Honolulu, rows of men stood in silence on the shoreline, eyes fixed on the peculiar shapes that waited in the shallows. 10 of them, low, box-like, armored hulls sitting awkwardly between land and sea. To some, they looked more like barges than weapons. Engines coughed to life, one after another, their sound rolling across the bay in uneven bursts. Mechanics moved among them, checking seals, bolting down hatches, tightening valves that had already been tested a dozen times that morning. The Marines assigned to crew these machines shifted uneasily, helmets low over their eyes. Few spoke. The ocean stretched before them, indifferent, its surface broken by the long Pacific swells that had swallowed so many small craft during earlier exercises. One eyewitness later recalled, "The first time those treads touched the water, you could feel everyone stop breathing. It wasn't just noise, it was a silence so sharp it hurt your ears. If the hull sank, that was it. No one would come back." The first LVT edged forward. Its treads churned the sand, then met the surf with a jolt. Spray lashed the bow. For an instant the vehicle seemed to hesitate, rocking uncertainly. Men on the beach clenched their fists. Then, slowly, the machine found its balance, riding forward like a squat beast forcing its way into the sea. Its bow rose, water slapped hard against the armored plates, but the hull stayed afloat. The treads churned, dragging the entire contraption outward. The driver inside gritted his teeth against the vibration, eyes locked on the compass fixed above the control panel. Behind it, another LVT lumbered into the waves. Then another. Within minutes, the bay was alive with steel hulls shouldering forward through the surf. 10 in all. The line wavered but did not break. One by one, they pushed into deeper water, their wakes stretching back toward the men who stood watching in disbelief. A shout broke from the beach. Then another. Relief surged through the ranks, men clapping helmets, slapping shoulders. Engineers, who only hours before had feared disaster, exchanged grim but unmistakable smiles. A sergeant with grease-stained hands muttered, "Well, I'll be damned. She floats." For the Marines, the success carried a sharper edge. Many of them, farm boys from the Midwest or mill workers from New England, had never learned to swim. They had been trained to fire rifles, throw grenades, dig foxholes, but not to survive the Pacific if the sea claimed them. Every exercise until now had been haunted by the same unspoken thought. A man who couldn't swim had no chance if the landing craft went down. Now, staring at the water buffaloes cutting across the bay, they felt a fragile kind of safety. The machine, ungainly as it looked, might just be their salvation. The training went on for days. Vehicles crawled from sand into surf, from surf back to sand, over and over until the sound of their engines became part of the island itself. Crews practiced sealing hatches under pressure, pumping out leaks, maneuvering through breaking waves. Officers took notes, filing reports in neat folders that would later be marked confidential and shipped east. One such report, preserved in the Naval Archives, contains a single, decisive line typed in block letters. "A tank that swims is no toy. It is the key without which the Pacific cannot be unlocked." But confidence, once sparked, carried its own weight. Everyone knew what came next. The machines were not built to parade up and down Hawaiian beaches. They were built for an invasion. Rumors spread quickly among the Marines. The Gilberts, they said. Tarawa. Few knew where that was on a map. Fewer still could pronounce BDO, the tiny atoll said to bristle with Japanese fortifications. But word filtered down. This was the real test. The vehicles would not be trialed in calm bays anymore. They would carry men across reefs under fire, into the teeth of bunkers and machine guns. The atmosphere shifted in the weeks that followed. Training was no longer just repetition, it was preparation for survival. Crews checked and rechecked seals until their fingers bled. Gunners memorized the feel of their weapons in the dark. Men who had once cursed the awkward machines began to treat them with a strange reverence, patting their armored sides as if the steel itself might one day protect them. On the docks at Pearl Harbor, as the first wave of LVTs was loaded aboard transports bound for the Gilberts, there was little ceremony. Cranes groaned, cables strained, and the ungainly shapes disappeared into the holds of ships. The Marines watched, quiet, knowing that once those machines left Hawaii, they would not return the same, if they returned at all. In one diary from a corporal stationed with the 2nd Marine Division, the words read like a prayer disguised as a note. When they put us on the water at Tarawa, either the Buffalo gets us across, or nothing will. The sea wind blew hard that night, carrying the smell of diesel and salt through the harbor. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay a strip of coral and sand where those words would be tested. And as the convoy pulled out into the Pacific, there was a weight in the air that every man felt. It was the sense that what lay ahead could not be undone. The line between invention and survival had vanished. Only the test of blood and fire remained. November 20th, 1943. The sky over the Gilbert Islands burned with the faint red of first light, a horizon that promised no warmth. At 5 o'clock, the thunder began, naval guns from the American fleet opening in relentless sequence. The sea itself shook. Shells screamed overhead and crashed into the tiny atoll of BDO, the westernmost tip of Tarawa, sending plumes of smoke and sand hundreds of feet into the air. Men aboard transports pressed against railings, straining to see through the haze. For 76 hours, intelligence had promised the island could not possibly endure such fire. But promises at sea were fragile things. The Marines waited below deck, silent, the smell of diesel and cordite filling their lungs. Helmets shifted on nervous heads, rifles clutched too tightly. Some whispered prayers, others mouthed curses. The order would come soon enough. When it did, the first wave clambered into Higgins' boats, flat-bottomed landing craft meant to rush the reef and spill men onto sand. Engines revved, ramps rattled shut. The boats churned forward into the surf. For a few hundred yards the illusion held. Then came the reef. The tide was wrong, lower than charts had suggested. One by one, the Higgins boats ground to a halt on the coral shelf, stranded more than 500 yards from the beach. The ramps fell, and Marines poured into waist-deep water, stumbling over jagged coral. Within seconds, the machine guns on BDO awoke. Long, controlled bursts sliced across the shallows. Men pitched forward, rifles lost, helmets spinning away on the tide. The ocean, already stained by the rising sun, turned red in streaks. And then, above the chaos, a new sound, a deeper, grinding roar. From the transports came the LVTs, the ungainly water buffaloes, steel hulls lurching into the waves. Where the boats had faltered, these machines clawed their way forward. Treads bit into the coral, tearing chunks free, dragging the vehicles over the reef as if it were nothing but broken earth. They lurched, rocked, but kept moving, bow waves parting around their armored sides. Japanese soldiers in the bunkers shouted, pointing. At first there was laughter, Bakatanku, stupid tanks. From a distance the machines looked fragile, toys unfit for the surf. But when they crawled past the stranded Higgins boats, when they drove straight through water foaming with bullets, the laughter died. One Marine, writing later in a letter never sent, described the moment. I saw men in the water burning. A Higgins had caught fire, fuel spreading like oil across the waves. The boys inside had no chance. And then, beside the flames, one of our buffaloes came through, churning straight for the beach. It didn't stop. It took some of us aboard, left the rest hanging on the sides, and it still kept going. That's how we made it ashore. We weren't brave. We were just alive because that thing didn't sink. The LVTs reached the sand, their sides scarred and pocked from small arms fire. Hatches flew open, Marines spilled out, stumbling through smoke. Some vehicles swung their mounted machine guns toward the bunkers, cutting arcs into the pillboxes. Others simply drove forward, beaching themselves in the shallows so that more men could scramble out. Behind them, The reef was a slaughterhouse, bodies drifting in the surf, waves carrying rifles and packs back out to sea. Inside one of the Japanese strongpoints, a corporal scribbled a hurried note that would later be found on his body. We fired and fired. They did not sink. They kept coming. By midday, fragments of the 2nd Marine Division clung to a strip of sand less than 200 yards deep. Every step forward had been bought with blood. The LVTs, once mocked, had become the only bridge across the reef. Their numbers thinned with every hour, wrecked by artillery or abandoned when fuel lines ruptured. Yet without them, the invasion would have drowned before it began. The heat rose as the sun climbed higher. Smoke and salt mixed in the air, burning the throat. Marines dug shallow depressions with their helmets, clinging to whatever cover the beach allowed. Dead and living lay side by side. The tide carried in more bodies, washing them against the sand with a steady rhythm, as if the ocean itself refused to give them back. Offshore, commanders debated whether the landing had already failed. Radios crackled with half-heard reports: pinned down, heavy fire, vehicles lost. Some officers argued for pulling back, regrouping, trying again another day. Others stared through binoculars, watching the men already trapped on the sand, and new retreat was no longer an option. As the sun dropped toward the horizon, the battle showed no sign of ending. The Japanese remained in their bunkers, machine guns unbroken, artillery still firing. The Marines, barely holding the beach, braced themselves for counterattacks that had not yet come. That night, under the smoke and the groans of the wounded, a sergeant scrawled in his notebook. They said Tarawa would be the test of the machine. But that was a lie. It was the test of us all. And still, beyond the darkness, the question loomed. How many more would the reef claim before dawn returned? January 31st, 1944. Night still clung to the lagoon around Kwajalein, the water black beneath a pale sliver of moon. On the decks of transport ships, Marines smoked in silence, hands cupped around matches to shield the glow. The salt air mixed with the stench of fuel and sweat. Some men played cards without speaking. Others stared at the horizon as though they might glimpse dawn before anyone else. In the dim light of a storage bay, a corporal hunched over his pack, scribbling one last letter home. The pencil moved quickly, as if time itself were running out. Above them, loudspeakers crackled with coded instructions. The invasion of the Marshall Islands had begun. Unlike Tarawa, this time there would be no tentative experiment. This time the LVTs would not be counted in dozens. More than 500 of the ungainly machines were lashed to the sides of transports, crowded on the decks of landing ships, their armored silhouettes lined like a silent battalion waiting for release. At 8:30, the signal came. Hatches yawned open, cranes groaned, ramps slammed into the sea. One after another, the water buffaloes surged forward. Engines roared as columns of exhaust mingled with mist, spreading across the lagoon in a haze that clung low over the water. From above, it must have looked like an iron tide rolling in, a swarm that blurred the line between land weapon and sea craft. For the first time in the Pacific War, the LVTs moved not as curiosities, but as the backbone of an assault. Waves of them poured from the ships in disciplined formation, their treads thrashing water into white foam. Marines crouched low inside, weapons clutched, hearts pounding. Japanese observers on Kwajalein recorded the moment in stunned fragments. One report later recovered read, "The enemy lands tanks from the sea. These are not boats. These are not tanks. They are something else." The defenders opened fire. Mortars dropped into the lagoon, geysers of spray hammering down among the lead vehicles. Artillery shells shrieked, bursting against the steel hulls. Machine gun fire raked the waves, tracers slicing red arcs through the haze. Some LVTs staggered under the blows, armor ringing, plates dented. A few stalled, drifting helplessly until rescue craft dragged them back. But most pushed forward, indifferent to the fury. Inside one vehicle, sweat dripped from a gunner's nose as he kept his finger steady on the trigger of a .50 caliber. The weapon barked, its recoil pounding through his shoulders as he swept bursts across the tree line. Another crewman rammed shells into the feed of a 37mm cannon, the report of each shot slamming against the confined steel walls. Their world had shrunk to vibration, smoke, and the sharp sting of powder in the nose. When the first wave hit the beach, coral shattered under the treads. Marines spilled out, some stumbling on sand made slick with salt and blood. Behind them, the LVTs did not stop. New waves carried crates of ammunition, radios, mortars, even small artillery pieces. The ungainly machines became lifelines, shuttling supplies forward while carrying the wounded back to the lagoon. For once, the Americans were not clawing for survival on the beach. They were overwhelming it. The Japanese bunkers fired until their barrels glowed. Yet the tide did not slow. In his field diary, a Japanese lieutenant wrote only one line before his position was obliterated by naval fire. "They are everywhere." By the second day, Kwajalein burned. Coconut palms toppled in waves of flame. Sand turned to glassy shards beneath the weight of bombardment. The LVTs still moved, unceasing, like ants in a colony, forward, backward, always carrying men or munitions. The defenders, hardened by years of war, could not comprehend the pace. Every lesson of island defense they had studied was undone by the simple fact that the enemy could bring not just men, but armor, guns, and endless supplies directly from ship to shore. A Marine captain who survived those days remembered, "We didn't think about the machines anymore. They were just part of the landscape, like the tide itself." You looked up and there was another buffalo, dragging ammo, or a dozen men, or hauling someone who'd lost a leg. They never stopped. By February 5th, resistance collapsed. The American flag rose over Kwajalein, torn and smoke-stained, but undeniable. 6 days. Commanders had feared weeks of attrition, had braced for losses that might equal Tarawa or worse. Instead, the atoll had fallen faster than any projection. In the after-action report filed to Pacific Command, an officer wrote with clinical precision, "Kwajalein secured in 6 days. Without amphibious tractors, casualty rate estimated at tenfold." The words were typed in black ink, but between the lines lived the truth. The tide of war in the Pacific had turned. June 15, 1944. Dawn bled across the Marianas in a haze of tropical heat. The waters off Saipan churned with the largest invasion force yet assembled in the Pacific. Hundreds of ships stretching to the horizon, their decks alive with movement, their radios spitting static and clipped commands. The Marines prepared in silence, the air thick with sweat and oil. The scent of cordite lingered from the bombardment that had raked the island through the night, a bombardment that turned entire ridges into plumes of dust. Yet even as the guns of the fleet thundered, the men knew the Japanese still waited, dug into caves and pillboxes, fanatics who would not yield. In the welled decks, the LVTs roared awake, their engines coughing in unison. By now, no one laughed at them, not the crews, not the infantry riding inside. These ungainly shapes of steel had carried men across Tarawa's reef, across Kwajalein's lagoon. Now they would face Saipan, a fortress where palm groves hid artillery and cliffs concealed ambushes. Marines climbed into the holds, pressing against each other in the suffocating dark. Helmets knocked together, rifles scraped against bulkheads. Someone muttered a prayer, another whispered a joke about the heat, but the tension sat heavy, unbroken. When the ramps dropped, the buffaloes surged forward, dozens at a time, engines shrieking, treads biting water. The sea foamed with their movement, the long columns weaving toward the beaches. Japanese gunners waited, their first salvos hammering into the lagoon. Shells burst into geysers around the formations. Marines inside clenched their jaws, clutching at steel handles as water poured across the decks. Yet still the machines pressed forward. For the first time in the war, they were met not only by bunkers, but by tanks. From behind the palms, Type 95 Hago light tanks rumbled into view, their silhouettes strange and menacing in the smoke. One eyewitness later described it with a shudder. "We saw the turret rise above the trees, and then the whole thing rolled out like a predator. It came straight at us, straight at our buffalo." The clash was sudden and brutal. A Hago fired, its shell striking the surf beside an LVT, sending a column of water skyward. Another hit landed true, tearing through the side of a vehicle and erupting in fire. Men screamed as they leapt into the sea, rifles useless, swimming desperately toward the reef. But not all went one way. The buffaloes answered. A 37mm gun cracked from the bow of an LVT, its round slamming into the Hago's thin armor. Flames burst from the turret, smoke curling upward as the Japanese tank shuddered, then fell silent. The battle became chaos, steel against steel, machine guns raking palm groves, shells exploding in the surf. Some LVTs carried Marines to the sand under fire, then wheeled about, fighting as mobile fortresses. Their heavy Brownings tore through Japanese positions, while others ferried ammunition and mortars directly into the fight. For the infantry, pinned in the shallows, the Buffaloes became more than transport. They were survival itself. But Saipan's horror was not confined to the beaches. As the Americans pushed inland, they encountered the civilian population, families driven to despair by propaganda, told by Japanese officers that capture meant torture or death. From cliffs and caves, civilians leapt to their deaths in sight of horrified Marines. Amid that despair, the Buffaloes became strange witnesses. Several accounts describe LVT crews hauling wounded men from the water, not just Marines, but islanders caught in the crossfire. One Marine wrote in his journal, "We hated the war. We hated what it made of men. But when the Buffalo pulled us out of the surf, or dragged a bleeding boy from the reef, we loved that machine like a brother. It gave us a chance to live." The fighting raged for weeks. Japanese counterattacks struck again and again, some at night, some with tanks, others with screaming infantry charges that broke against American lines like waves on coral. Each time, the Buffaloes were there, hauling supplies, ferrying reinforcements, mounting guns in support. Their presence no longer seemed experimental. It was essential. By the campaign's end, Saipan lay in ruins. The beaches were littered with wreckage, palm trunks splintered, sand darkened with oil and blood. Among the prisoners taken was a Japanese officer, his face gaunt, his uniform torn. In interrogation, he admitted what his commanders had never wanted to believe. "We laughed at your tanks on the sea. We thought them foolish. Now we understand. That was our mistake." The words were simple, almost quiet, but they carried the weight of all that had been lost. The Americans listened, weary, their faces unreadable. For them, there was no triumph, only exhaustion, the echo of screams still hanging over the island. And beyond Saipan, beyond the ruins and the graves, another horizon already loomed. Orders circulated quietly through the fleet. The next target was Iwo Jima. February 19, 1945. The sea off Iwo Jima was black with smoke before dawn. Battleships and cruisers had shelled the island for 3 days, yet when the guns fell silent, the silhouette of Mount Suribachi still rose unbroken, a dark pyramid of volcanic rock against the ash-colored sky. On the decks of transports, Marines stared at the outline, helmets low, faces grim. Some chewed gum without tasting it. Others fingered photographs tucked into breast pockets. Everyone knew this one would be worse. The island was small, only 5 miles long, but Japanese engineers had turned it into a labyrinth, tunnels, pillboxes, and hidden artillery bunkers buried deep in the volcanic stone. The men waiting in the surf understood what that meant. Every yard would be bought with blood. Engines roared in the well decks. The Buffaloes, scarred veterans of Tarawa, Kwajalein, and Saipan, were once again first to move. Their hulls rattled as crews sealed hatches and checked weapons. The smell of diesel filled the dark spaces, mixing with sweat and the acrid memory of gunpowder that drifted from the beach. A corporal scribbled a line into his diary before climbing inside. "If we burn today, we burn together. But without this machine, none of us sets foot on that sand." The ramps slammed down. LVTs surged into the waves in long lines, a steel phalanx advancing toward the black beach. For a moment, it felt almost routine, another landing, another hostile shore. Then the guns opened. The Japanese had held their fire through the bombardment, waiting for this moment. From concealed positions along Suribachi and the northern ridges, artillery roared. Shells tore into the waves, smashing into the lead Buffaloes. One erupted in flame, smoke pouring skyward as men clawed their way out into the surf. Another lurched sideways, its track sheared off, before a second shell finished it, leaving nothing but twisted steel. Marines inside the surviving vehicles felt every impact in their bones. The clang of ricochets rang against the armor. Splinters sliced through hatches. Gunners fired back blindly, their tracers disappearing into smoke. Still, the Buffaloes ground forward, dragging themselves through the surf like wounded animals refusing to stop. When the first LVTs slammed onto the volcanic sand, their treads sank deep, bogging in the coarse black grit. Marines poured out, stumbling under fire, some dropping face-first into the ash before they had taken 3 steps. Others crawled forward, rifles clutched tight, praying the next shell would miss. Behind them, more buffaloes arrived, disgorging wave after wave of men, until the shoreline was choked with bodies, smoke, and steel. The cost was staggering. Dozens of LVTs were destroyed within hours. Flames dotted the beach like torches, pillars of smoke twisting into the gray sky. Survivors spoke of hearing the screams of men trapped inside burning vehicles, hatches jammed shut. One Marine later wrote, "My buffalo was hit. Fire everywhere. I jumped, landed in water up to my waist, ran until the sand swallowed my legs. But if not for that machine, I'd never have set foot here at all." And yet, for all their losses, the mission was accomplished. By the end of the first day, Marines held a thin, brutal line across the beach. The buffaloes that survived kept running, dragging ammunition and stretchers through firestorms, carrying out the wounded, shuttling supplies forward. Many never returned, consumed by shellfire. But enough had done their job. The Marines were on Iwo Jima, and the foothold was theirs. The battle stretched on for weeks. Every cave had to be burned or blasted. Every ridge was taken and retaken. The black sand drank the blood of thousands. But above it all, the image that would define the campaign took shape. Marines raising the flag atop Mount Suribachi. The moment was immortalized in a photograph, a symbol of triumph, of endurance. Yet behind the frame of that picture lay the truth. That flag could not have been planted without the machines that had delivered men to the shore beneath it. In the quiet that followed, after the guns ceased and the island was declared secured, the beaches of Iwo lay littered with carcasses of buffaloes. Some were burned-out shells, others half-buried in volcanic ash, treads twisted, hulls blackened. They stood like gravestones for the men they had carried. An officer surveying the wreckage wrote simply, "The tractors burned. The men burned. But because of them, the landing succeeded." And so the story ended where it had begun, on the edge of disbelief. In 1943, officers in Rabaul had laughed, calling them toys, steel bathtubs doomed to sink. In 1945, their laughter was gone. It had drowned in the surf at Tarawa, been buried in the sands of Kwajalein, silenced in the jungles of Saipan, and finally smothered in the ash of Iwo Jima. The Pacific War rolled forward, toward Okinawa, toward the bomb, toward its terrible conclusion. But the lesson remained, written in fire and blood. America had brought to the ocean a weapon that refused the word impossible.